She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even look up at the men who were laughing. Emily Carter hit the floor of Redstone Military Medical Center's trauma bay so hard her elbow split open on the tile. Blood dotted the linoleum in a neat little arc. Around her, 3 physicians, men with brass on their lapels and decades of institutional protection in their pockets, stood and watched. One of them smirked. The security officer near the door found something interesting to study on the ceiling. Emily pressed one hand to the floor, then the other. She stood up, wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her wrist, and walked out of the room without saying a single word. No one stopped her. No one apologized. No one thought they needed to. That was their first mistake. It would not be their last. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome. Follow my channel so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is going somewhere none of them expected. Hit like if you're already angry, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The assignment letter had arrived 6 weeks earlier, printed on Department of Defense letterhead, with the kind of bureaucratic formality that made everything feel both official and strangely hollow. Emily read it twice at her kitchen table in Clarksburg, Maryland, the coffee going cold beside her laptop. Director of Emergency Trauma Training, Redstone Military Medical Center, Ashford, Virginia. A title that sounded important, a role that was supposed to be. She didn't celebrate. She folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and went for a run. Her neighbor, a retired postman named Gerald, was watering his front lawn when she passed. "Good news?" he called out, because he'd seen her expression reading the mail. "Change of scenery," she said, and kept running. That was Emily. She didn't do announcements, she didn't do fanfare. She had spent 11 years doing a job that required absolute precision in conditions that would unhinge most people, and somewhere along the way the impulse to explain herself to anyone had quietly burned away. She arrived in Ashford on a Tuesday in late October, the Blue Ridge foothills already going gold and rust in the distance. Redstone Military Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of a mid-sized military installation, a 6-story complex of aging brick and newer construction additions that had been bolted together across 3 different decades. The main building still had the bones of a 1970s Army hospital. Wide corridors, low ceilings, institutional green tile that no renovation budget had ever fully replaced. The newer wings had glass and steel and the kind of tasteful signage that was meant to communicate competence. It mostly communicated that someone had spent money. Emily parked her car, sat for a moment looking at the entrance, and pulled on her jacket. She had been in worse places. She reminded herself of that without drama, the way a person reminds themselves to check their pockets before leaving the house. Just a fact. A reference point. Inside the administrative liaison, a young Army specialist named Torres was waiting with a lanyard badge and a folder of orientation materials. Torres had a handshake that was too firm and eyes that were making rapid calculations about what to make of her. Early 30s, medium height, dark hair pulled back. No rank insignia, just civilian business attire. She could read the flicker of surprise. It happened with most people. "Dr. Vaughn wanted to meet with you at 11, Torres said, leading her down the main corridor. "Okay." Torres paused. "He's been here a long time, runs a tight facility." "I'm sure he does," Emily said, because she wasn't going to make Torres's day harder than it needed to be. Dr. Richard Vaughn had the corner office on the 3rd floor, with windows that looked out over the parking structure, which wasn't much of a view, but he'd positioned his desk to face the door rather than the window, which told Emily something before he'd opened his mouth. He was in his mid-50s, trim, gray at the temples, with the particular bearing of a man who had been the most important person in every room he'd entered for about 20 years and had stopped noticing that he expected it. He looked up from his desk when she walked in, let the moment extend a beat longer than necessary, and then set down his pen. "Ms. Carter. Not doctor, not director. Ms. Dr. Vaughn." She sat without being invited to, which she could tell landed slightly wrong with him. Good. He looked at her file, which was open on his desk. She could see it was her civilian personnel record, the standard background document that listed her nursing credentials, her certifications, her positions at 2 civilian trauma centers before this appointment. Clean, complete, and deliberately limited. I'll be honest, Vaughn said, settling back in his chair. This appointment came through channels that bypassed my input entirely. DoD Civilian Integration Initiative, they said. I wasn't consulted on the selection. That's usually how appointments work, Emily said. Something shifted in his jaw, barely perceptible. The emergency trauma training program here is established. My physicians have developed the protocols, the evaluation metrics, the simulation curriculum. We don't need external revision. The appointment isn't about revision, it's about standardization for military-civilian integration requirements. Which a civilian nurse, Vaughn said with precise and practiced emphasis on the word civilian, is uniquely unqualified to lead. Emily didn't move. She looked at him calmly, the way she'd once looked at a field situation that had 17 active variables and 4 seconds to process them. I appreciate your transparency, she said. Is there anything else you need from me today? He hadn't expected that either, the courtesy coming back at him when he'd thrown something else. He paused, recalibrated, and nodded toward the door. Torres will show you to your office. Department heads meet Fridays at 7. The office they'd given her was on the second floor near the supply corridor, a repurposed storage room that still had shelving brackets on one wall and smelled faintly of floor cleaner. There was a desk, a chair, and a window that looked into an internal courtyard where a heating unit sat rusting. Torres looked mortified about it. This is, fine, Emily said. She set her bag down, looked around the room once, and opened her laptop. Torres hovered in the doorway. I can put in a request for a different space. Don't worry about it. Thanks, Torres. He left. Emily sat down, opened a blank document, and typed the date. Then she started writing. The first week at Redstone was clarifying in the way that cold water is clarifying. You didn't enjoy the experience, but afterward you understood the situation with perfect precision. Vaughn didn't ignore her. That would have been a manageable problem. Instead, he addressed her in meetings in the particular way that skilled institutional bullies address people they've decided to neutralize, publicly, often, with just enough plausible deniability that anyone watching would struggle to define what exactly was wrong about it. Ms. Carter has some ideas about trauma rotation scheduling, he told his department heads at the Friday meeting, voice carrying the faint tone of a teacher reading a particularly creative but misguided student essay. I thought we'd give her the floor. 4 department heads, all men, all with the same evaluating stillness that Vaughn had. Emily presented the 30-minute assessment she'd prepared, pulling up data on current certification gaps between military and civilian emergency protocols, the DoD integration benchmarks that Redstone was currently running below, the simulation-to-live scenario ratio that put them at statistical disadvantage in surge capacity planning. She had the numbers. She had the citations. She had the comparative analysis of 3 other military medical centers that had already begun the integration process. When she finished, Vaughn thanked her with a tone that sounded exactly like a compliment and functioned exactly like a dismissal. Very thorough. For an overview, Dr. Maher will probably have some thoughts about the benchmarking methodology. Dr. Maher, a large man with the kind of confidence that comes from never being seriously challenged, leaned forward. What's your background in military trauma? Specifically? I'm not here to discuss my background, Emily said. I'm here to discuss the program. That's the issue, Maher said with a friendly smile. The program is built on military experience. Someone without that experience directing it is a structural problem. The appointment came from DoD. If you'd like to contest the structural decision, I'd recommend taking that up with the integration office. She gathered her materials and left the meeting 3 minutes before it officially ended. Behind her, she heard the shift in the room's atmosphere, the particular silence of men recalibrating. She went back to her repurposed closet of an office and updated her notes. She'd been documenting since the first day. Not obsessively, not angrily, but with the kind of methodical consistency she'd learned in environments where documentation was the difference between accountability and impunity. Dates, times, exact words, names of witnesses present. She had a separate folder for every incident, organized by department head and chronology. She wasn't building a complaint yet. She was building a record. Well, the younger nurses found her first. It made sense. They were lower on the hierarchy, which meant they occupied the institutional spaces that the senior staff didn't monitor, and they watched everything. In hospitals, the nurses always do. A second-year trauma nurse named Brianna Okafor introduced herself outside the cafeteria on Emily's fourth day, which was notable because most of the staff had been given the unspoken signal to maintain cordial distance. "I looked up your certifications," Okafor said directly, in the way of someone who had decided to skip the preamble. "You've got TNCC ATLS CCRN. That's not a civilian-only profile." Emily looked at her, measuring. "Those are standard advanced trauma certifications. Standard for someone with significant exposure to complex trauma scenarios," Okafor said. "The kind that hospitals like this don't fully replicate." Emily ate a forkful of her salad. "What's your point, Okafor?" "I'm just wondering why you're pretending to be less than you are." "I'm not pretending anything. I'm doing my job." Okafor sat down across from her with the boldness of someone who'd decided the social risk was worth it. "Vaughn is going to come after you harder. He does it to anyone he thinks is a threat to his position. Last year he pushed out a surgical attending who'd questioned one of his procurement decisions. Month before that, a charge nurse filed a complaint and her schedule got restructured until she quit." Emily set down her fork. "Are you telling me this because you think I need a warning, or because you want to know if I'm worth the risk of being associated with?" Okafor held eye contact. "Both." Emily almost smiled. "Watch how I work. Then decide." It wasn't encouragement, exactly, but Okafor seemed to take it as something. 3 other nurses started hovering in her orbit over the following week. Reyes, a former Navy corpsman who'd cross-trained into civilian medicine. Park, a young woman 2 years out of nursing school who was sharper than anyone in the department had given her credit for. And a quiet, large man named Dobbins, who said almost nothing but had the hands and reflexes of someone who'd worked far more extreme situations than a hospital trauma bay would normally produce. They weren't allies yet. They were people paying attention, which was something. Well, the trauma simulation drills were Vaughn's territory, and he made that clear by scheduling them at 6 a.m. and ensuring Emily received the notification at 5:47 a.m. through Torres, who was mortified again. She showed up anyway, pulling on her badge in the elevator, arriving at the simulation lab to find Vaughn already positioned at the center of the room with his department heads arranged around him like a board portrait. "We were about to start," he said. "Then let's start," Emily said, and moved to a position along the wall where she could observe. What she watched over the next 40 minutes was technically proficient and operationally rigid. Vaughn's team ran a 4-casualty mass trauma drill with the kind of crisp execution that came from running the same scenario in the same sequence enough times that it had become muscle memory rather than adaptive response. The team communicated with minimal friction. The triage went smoothly, the timing was good, and it would have failed catastrophically in any real surge situation because it was built on the assumption that casualties arrive in a manageable sequence, that the team is fully staffed, and that there are no environmental complications. Emily counted 4 decision points where real-world variables would have cascaded the scenario into chaos that the team was not structured to handle. She wrote all of this in her notes afterward. She did not say it out loud in the debrief. "Any observations?" Vaughn asked her at the end, the tone suggesting he expected none worth hearing. "The team executes the design scenario well," Emily said. "I'd like to run supplemental drills testing surge, capacity, and degraded resource response in the next 30 days as part of the integration evaluation. That would require schedule restructuring. I'll work around existing schedules. I'd need to approve any simulation parameters. The Federal Integration Office has already provided the evaluation framework. I'll send it to you before end of day." The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough to be deliberate. "Fine," Vaughn said. She sent the evaluation framework at 4:58 p.m. He didn't respond. It escalated in the second week. She'd expected that. The access codes to the simulation lab's equipment management system were changed without notification, and her login credentials stopped working. She had Torres request restoration 3 times before she simply worked around the system, pulling equipment manually and logging it herself. Vaughn expressed polite concern about the access issue at their next brief encounter and said he'd have IT look into it. IT didn't contact her. At a department briefing, her presentation materials, which she'd submitted to the shared drive at Vaughn's request, were not displayed. The projector was ready. Her files were not there. Vaughn moved on without acknowledgement. She sat through 40 minutes of a meeting that had erased her, then went back to her office and noted the time, the date, and the fact that 3 of Vaughn's assistants had been in the room. She called Torres afterward. "Who has access to the shared drive for the third-floor conference room?" Torres, very carefully, "The administrative staff and Dr. Vaughn's office." "Thank you, Torres." "Ms. Carter." A pause. "I'm sorry, for what it's worth." "Do your job, Torres. That's enough." She wasn't angry. She'd trained herself out of operational anger years ago because it clouded assessment and wasted energy. What she was, precisely and continuously, was observant. She had been watching Vaughn for 3 weeks, and she had a complete picture of how he operated, who covered for him, where the gaps in his institutional protection were, and what it would take to dismantle it. She was also watching him get sloppy. Bullies got sloppy when their target didn't fight back in the expected ways. They pushed harder because the lack of reaction felt like permission, not restraint. Vaughn was starting to mistake her composure for weakness. She recognized this. It was useful. The trauma demonstration was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the 3rd week, and it was, in retrospect, the moment Vaughn stopped being careful. It was designed as a showcase. New residents observing advanced trauma technique, cameras running for the department's training archive, a room full of witnesses. Vaughn was demonstrating multi-system trauma management on a simulation mannequin, and Emily had been asked, in the particular bureaucratic way that made requests feel mandatory, to assist with equipment positioning. She was standing at the supply station to the right of the demonstration table when it happened. Vaughn was mid-sentence, addressing the residents, and turned with a piece of equipment that caught her at the shoulder. Not accidental, the angle and force were wrong for accidental. She processed this in the half-second before the floor came up at her, and then she was down, the impact ringing through her elbow and jaw where it caught the edge of the equipment cart. The room went very still. Then, at the back, one of the department heads, Mar, made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same family. The security officer in the corner of the room looked at the wall. Emily lay on the floor for exactly 2 seconds, which was the time it took her to assess whether anything was broken. Elbow split and bleeding, lip caught something, no fractures. And then she pushed to her knees and stood up. She wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her wrist. She looked at no one in particular. Then she picked up the supply clipboard from where it had clattered beside her, set it back on the cart, and walked out of the room. She heard Vaughn resuming his demonstration behind her. Normal tone, normal pace, as if she'd been a small interruption. In the hallway, she stopped at the nearest restroom, ran cold water over her elbow, pressed a paper towel against her lip, and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Her hands were completely steady. She went back to her office, sat down at her desk, and opened her documentation folder. She noted the time, 9:47 a.m. She noted Vaughn's name, Mar's name, the security officer's badge number. She'd read it in the 2 seconds she'd spent on the floor. She noted every name she'd seen in that room. Then she opened a new email, addressed to the Department of Defense Civilian Integration Office, and typed 3 sentences requesting a formally monitored federal evaluation of the Emergency Trauma Training Program at Redstone Military Medical Center to be conducted under the parameters of the integration framework she had already submitted. She attached the framework document, which she had never actually expected Vaughn to review. She had written it specifically for this purpose. She sent the email and sat back. Outside her window, the rusting heating unit in the courtyard ticked in the autumn cold. Somewhere down the corridor, she could hear the simulation lab clearing out, footsteps and voices dissipating as the demonstration ended and the residents dispersed. Normal sounds. Normal morning. She opened the camera application on her phone, found the folder she'd been quietly building for 3 weeks, footage from her office, audio from the briefings she'd legally recorded in a one-party consent state, photographs of access logs and email timestamps, and backed the entire archive to an encrypted server that existed on an infrastructure Vaughn had no awareness of and no access to. Then she pulled out a notepad and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. The evaluation request would take, she estimated, 5 to 8 business days to process through the integration office. Possibly less, given certain particulars about who exactly had countersigned her appointment that Vaughn had not bothered to investigate. She pressed the paper towel against her lip one more time. Down the hall, Torres appeared in her doorway, face white, clearly having heard something. "Ms. Carter, are you—" "I'm fine, Torres." "I heard that Dr. Vaughn—" "Torres." She waited until he looked at her directly. "Document what you saw today. Everything, specifically. Time, location, what you observed. Keep a copy somewhere outside this building." He stared at her. "You're not going to file a—" "I'm going to do exactly what I came here to do," she said quietly. "Just not yet." Torres stood in the doorway a moment longer, reading something in her face that he seemed to find simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. Then he nodded once and left. Emily turned back to her desk. She had 5 days, maybe less. Long enough to let Vaughn believe he'd won something. Long enough for him to keep talking to his department heads and his security staff and his administrative allies, building the paper trail she needed on his side of the ledger. She opened a new page of notes and started writing. She did not notice the slight figure that had stopped in the corridor outside her office door, Okafor standing very still, who had seen the paper towel against Emily's lip and the absolutely unshaken expression on her face, and who stood there for a long moment before quietly walking away. Or the way Okafor pulled out her own phone as she walked and started typing a message to Reyes and Park and Dobbins. "Something is about to happen," she wrote. "Pay attention." She was right. And she was the first of them to understand that the woman in the storage room office hadn't been running from anything. She'd been waiting. Okafor's message sat in Reyes's phone for 11 minutes before he responded, which was about 10 minutes longer than usual. He'd been in the supply corridor when it happened. Not in the room, but close enough that he'd heard the sound. Not the impact itself, but the quality of silence that followed it. That specific held-breath moment that emergency staff learn to recognize because it means something has gone wrong in a way that hasn't been classified yet. He'd looked through the small window in the corridor door and seen enough. Emily Carter getting up from the floor, the security officer examining the ceiling, Vaughn resuming his demonstration with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who believed consequence was something that happened to other people. Reyes had been in military medicine long enough to know what that ease meant. It meant Vaughn had done this before, and nothing had stopped him. He typed back to Okafor. "I'm in." He didn't specify what he was in for because he didn't entirely know yet, but he'd spent 4 years as a Navy corpsman and 3 more as a civilian trauma nurse, and one thing that experience had consistently taught him was that the people who didn't react the way you expected them to were almost always the people you needed to watch most carefully. Emily Carter had walked out of that room like someone who had already calculated what came next. That was not a civilian response. That was not even a trauma nurse response. That was something else. And he intended to find out what. The 5 days Emily had estimated turned into 4. She was in her office at 7:15 on a Monday morning when the email came through from the DoD Civilian Integration Office. Not from the standard administrative contact she'd addressed her request to, but from a different office entirely. Office of Military Medical Standards and Evaluation. The response was brief, formal, and notable for 3 things. The authorization level attached to it was 2 pay grades above what her integration request should have required. The evaluation had been accelerated to the following Thursday, and the signatory was a colonel named Patricia Wynn, whose name Emily recognized because she'd served under Wynn's command structure during her second deployment and knew exactly what that office did when it mobilized quickly. She closed the email, sat with it for a moment, and then did something she hadn't done since arriving at Redstone. She called someone. The number rang twice. A voice she knew. "Carter?" "I got the authorization," she said, a short pause. Faster than expected. "They bumped it up the chain, Wynn's office." "That's not standard integration review." "No," Emily agreed. "It's not." Another pause. "You need anything from me?" "Not yet." She looked at the autumn light coming through her courtyard window, the rust on the heating unit catching a pale gold. "Just wanted you to know the timeline moved." "Be careful, Emily." "I'm always careful." She ended the call and set the phone face down on her desk. Then she opened her documentation archive, pulled the chronological event log, and spent 40 minutes reviewing it for the third time since she'd compiled it. Not because she needed to memorize it, she already had, but because she needed to make sure the documentation was clean. No ambiguity, no emotional language, no gaps that a skilled defense attorney could widen into reasonable doubt. It was. She forwarded the archive to 2 separate external servers and printed a physical copy, which she folded and placed in her jacket pocket. Then she went to the nursing station on the 2nd floor and asked for coffee, because the machine in her office hallway was broken and had been for a week, and she needed to start the day. Okafor found her there, which was increasingly becoming a pattern. "Thursday," Okafor said, appearing beside her with the particular casualness of someone who had clearly been watching for her. Emily looked at her sideways. "Excuse me?" "I heard Torres on the phone with someone from the administrative office this morning. Federal evaluation scheduled for Thursday." A pause. "I wasn't eavesdropping. He wasn't being quiet." "And you're telling me this because Vaughn knows," Okafor said, voice dropping a register. "He called an all-department heads meeting this morning. Closed door, no minutes. Whatever he's planning, he's moving fast." Emily poured her coffee, added nothing to it, took a sip. "What do you want me to do with that information, Okafor?" "I want you to not be blindsided." A beat. "Whatever you're doing, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but it's not nothing, and whatever it is requires you to still be standing Thursday morning." Emily looked at her directly. Okafor was 26, maybe 27, with the steady eyes of someone who'd watched too many people older and more powerful than her make decisions that hurt people below them on the hierarchy. There was something in her face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. It was the expression of someone who had decided that the personal cost of staying quiet was no longer acceptable. Emily understood that expression. She'd worn it herself once in a different context. "Vaughn is going to try to restructure the evaluation parameters," Emily said. "He'll argue that the review should be conducted under his existing assessment framework rather than the federal integration template. He may try to formally contest my authority to request the evaluation at all, which he'll lose, but it'll buy him time and generate noise." Okafor absorbed this. "And if he escalates beyond that?" "He already has." Emily set her coffee down. "The evaluation is Thursday. Between now and then, stay out of the direct line of fire. That includes not being visibly associated with me in departmental settings." "I'm not particularly worried about—" "I know you're not," Emily said. "I'm asking anyway. Not for your sake." Okafor paused. "For yours. For the integrity of the documentation. Independent witnesses carry more weight when they haven't been seen coordinating with the subject of the evaluation." A moment of recalibration on Okafor's face as she understood what that meant. Not just an evaluation of Redstone's programs, an evaluation during which Emily Carter intended to ensure that everything Vaughn had done was visible to federal observers with full standing to act on it. "Oh," Okafor said quietly. "Go do your shift," Emily said, and picked up her coffee again. Vaughn moved within the hour. She heard about it from Torres, who appeared in her doorway with the expression of a man who had recently learned that being a middleman was the worst possible position to occupy in an institutional conflict. "Dr. Vaughn has submitted a formal objection to the evaluation timeline," Torres said. "He's arguing that 4 days is insufficient preparation time for a full federal review. The federal integration framework requires 48-hour notice for standard evaluations," Emily said, without looking up from her laptop. "The Thursday timeline exceeds that requirement. He's also—" Torres hesitated. "He's requesting a review of your appointment authorization. He's suggesting the language of the DoD Integration Directive may not specifically empower a civilian training director to independently initiate a federal evaluation request." Emily looked up. "Has he submitted that request through the integration office?" "Through hospital administration and through Colonel Wynn's office, as of this morning." She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Torres." "Ms. Carter—" He stopped himself. "Say it." "Is this going to work?" he asked, in the voice of someone asking the question they'd been holding for 3 weeks. She considered him for a moment. Torres, who had apologized for her supply closet office, who had looked mortified at every incremental cruelty, who had made the micro-calculations of a person trying to stay employed and keep a conscience simultaneously. He wasn't a hero. He was a young man in an impossible position, doing small, decent things when he could afford to. Yes, she said, not to reassure him, because it was accurate. He left. She went back to her laptop and opened the response she'd already drafted to the integration office, countering each of Vaughn's objections with the specific regulatory language that made them inapplicable. She sent it at 9:03 a.m. Colonel Wynn's office responded at 10:47 a.m. with a one-line confirmation. Evaluation timeline unchanged. She forwarded that response to her external archive and went to run a simulation drill she'd scheduled with the second-floor nursing staff. A degraded resource mass casualty scenario she'd written herself, run without advance notice, during a routine shift change so she'd catch a natural staffing mix rather than a prepared team. Reyes was there. So was Park, who had the wide-eyed look of someone who hadn't expected to find herself managing a simulated 4-casualty intake during what was supposed to be a standard Tuesday morning. Dobbins was there by accident, ending his overnight shift at the same moment the drill began, and he stayed because the scenario engaged something in him that a normal shift change wouldn't have. Emily ran the drill for 22 minutes. She said almost nothing during it, interjected twice, redirected once, let them find their own failures and correct them in real time rather than pausing to explain. When it was over, she had 4 pages of notes. "What happened at minute 11?" she asked Reyes. He was still slightly winded. "Communication gap. Triage called clear on bed 3 before the secondary assessment was complete. How do you close that gap structurally, not individually?" A pause while he thought. "Checkpoint protocol. The triage lead can't call clear without a verbal confirmation from the secondary assessor. Write that up. Send it to me by end of shift." She looked around at all of them, Reyes, Park, Dobbins, and 6 other nurses who'd been pulled into the drill by simple proximity. That was a functional response in a compromised scenario. Most of what you did was correct. The rest we can fix. She paused. Questions? A nurse named Yates, who Emily didn't know well, raised her hand. "Are we going to be evaluated Thursday? Like formally?" "The federal evaluation is of the program," Emily said. "You'll perform patient care the way you always do." "Vaughn's going to be running point on the official side," Yates said, with the careful neutrality of someone stating a fact they'd rather not state. "I know. So what exactly are you—" "Do the job," Emily said, not unkindly. "That's all I'm asking any of you to do. Just do the job correctly." She left the floor and went back to her office, and she almost made it there before she ran into Maher in the corridor. Maher was the kind of man who took up more space than he needed to, physically and otherwise. He stopped in front of her with the particular positioning of someone who'd decided to make a hallway feel smaller. "Heard you ran an unsanctioned drill this morning," he said. "Supplemental training session within my program authority." "There's a question about the scope of your program authority, actually." His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant, which was worse than hostility. "Richard's submitting a pretty comprehensive jurisdictional review. Might put a hold on your training activities pending outcome." "He's welcome to submit whatever he'd like," Emily said. "Excuse me." She moved to go around him. He shifted, not quite blocking, but close enough that the message was clear. "You should think about what Thursday looks like if the evaluation doesn't go the way you're expecting," he said. She stopped. She looked at him, and she didn't look away, and something in her expression made him hold very still for a moment, because whatever he saw there was not what he expected. "I've been thinking about Thursday since I sent the request," she said. "Have a good morning, Dr. Maher." She walked past him and didn't hear him move for a full 3 seconds, which meant he stood watching her go, which was fine. Let him look, let him carry that back to Vaughn's closed-door meeting and explain what exactly he'd seen in her face when she wasn't afraid. Wednesday arrived with the particular charged quality of the day before something significant. Emily felt it the moment she walked in the way the administrative staff made slightly too much of an effort to appear normal, in the way the corridor outside Vaughn's office had more foot traffic than usual, in the way Torres handed her the morning communication log without his customary hesitation, as if he were moving quickly to minimize his exposure to the thing that was coming. She ran 2 more supplemental training sessions. She completed her equipment audit. She submitted her program status report to the integration office on schedule, including all outstanding documentation requests that Vaughn had declined to fulfill, which meant her report noted their absence, which meant they would be visible to the federal evaluators before the evaluation began. At 2 p.m., something unexpected happened. A young resident named Flores caught her in the hallway near the pharmacy wing and said, with the anxious quickness of someone who'd been building up to something, "I was in the room Thursday, 3 weeks ago, the demonstration." Emily waited. "I didn't do anything," Flores said. Nobody said anything. I didn't say anything. He stopped. "I was standing 4 feet away. I saw exactly what happened. I have the whole thing on my phone because I was filming the technique for my study notes." Emily was very still. "Have you shown that footage to anyone?" "No, I didn't know what to do with it." He looked genuinely sick about this, which was different from guilty, and she recognized the difference. "I'm a first-year resident. Vaughn controls my evaluation, my rotation assignments, my references. I'm not asking you to do anything," Emily said, "but I'm not asking." She held his eyes. "You have to decide for yourself what you can live with. That's a real decision with real consequences, and I'm not going to minimize it." He stood there with the footage in his phone and everything it meant, and didn't say anything for a long moment. "The federal evaluators arrive at 8 tomorrow morning," Emily said. "That's the only information I'm going to give you." She walked away. She didn't look back to see if he was still standing there because it wasn't her choice to make. But she thought about him that evening, sitting in her rented apartment 3 miles from Redstone, eating takeout from a Thai place that was the only restaurant she'd found near the installation that was actually good. She thought about Flores and the weight of being 26 years old with a career that felt conditional on the goodwill of a man who shoved women to the floor in front of witnesses and kept their jobs. She'd been that age in different circumstances. The weight was familiar, even if the shape was different. She cleaned up, made sure her documentation archive was current and accessible, set her alarm for 5:30, and went to bed. She slept 4 hours and didn't dream. Thursday arrived gray and cold, a Virginia November morning with frost on the parking lot and breath visible in the air outside the main entrance. Emily was inside by 6:15 a.m., which was early enough to have the simulation lab to herself for 40 minutes. She didn't run anything. She just walked the space, checked the equipment layout, confirmed the camera positions she'd cataloged weeks ago, and stood in the center of the room for a moment with her hands in her pockets. She'd stood in worse rooms. She reminded herself of this without sentiment. At 7:45, Torres found her in the hallway with the particular energy of someone whose morning had already held more than it should. "They're here," he said. "Federal evaluators. 6 of them, military uniforms. He lowered his voice. "Ms. Carter, there's a general." She looked at him. "What kind of general?" "1 star. Army Medical Corps." Torres's voice was doing something uncertain. They went straight to the conference room on the 5th floor. Dr. Vaughn met them up there. He's been there 30 minutes. Emily checked her watch. The evaluation wasn't scheduled to begin until 8. Vaughn was up there early, which meant he was trying to frame the narrative before the official proceedings began, which was a move that would have been more effective if Colonel Wynn's office hadn't already received Emily's full documentation package 2 days ago. "Thank you, Torres," she said. "What do you need?" "Nothing right now." She thought for a second. "Actually, find Okafor, Reyes, and Park. Tell them the evaluation starts at 8 in the simulation lab. Standard trauma demonstration as outlined in the federal framework. They should be there." Torres nodded and moved, slightly too quickly, in the way of someone who needed to be moving. Emily took the stairs to the 5th floor. The conference room had a glass panel beside the door, and through it she could see Vaughn at the head of the table, composed, authoritative, in his element, presenting to 6 uniformed figures. She couldn't hear him through the door, but his body language was clear. This was his facility, his program, and he was explaining it to visitors who needed orienting. One of the uniformed figures turned slightly, and Emily caught a profile she recognized. She'd met Brigadier General Susan Alderman exactly twice, once in a field briefing context, and once at a medical after-action review. But she remembered her clearly because Alderman was the kind of person who left a mark by doing very little visibly while seeing everything. She was in her early 50s, compact and precise, with the particular stillness of someone who had trained herself to reveal nothing prematurely. Emily did not walk into the conference room. She had not been summoned there, and walking in would give Vaughn the opportunity to control the context of her introduction. Instead, she went to the simulation lab, checked the equipment setup, and waited. At 8:07, the evaluators arrived. Vaughn came in first, which was a choice, followed by the evaluation team in a cluster, Alderman at the rear. He'd managed to position himself as the guide to the space, the authority introducing the program. And then he saw Emily standing at the main equipment station, and something moved through his face that he controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I thought you'd be with the nursing staff." "I'm where I'm supposed to be," she said. Alderman's eyes moved to Emily, held there for exactly a second, and then moved away. One of the other evaluators, a lieutenant colonel with a medical corps insignia, stepped forward with a clipboard and introduced himself to the room. "We'll begin with the program overview and proceed through the simulation assessment. Dr. Vaughn, if you'd like to start with the training protocol overview." "Actually," Vaughn said, with the smooth confidence of a man deploying a prepared move, "before we begin, I want to note for the record that there are some outstanding questions about the scope of authority under which this evaluation was requested, and I've submitted documentation to—" "We've reviewed Dr. Vaughn's submission," Alderman said from the back of the room. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "And the integration office's response. The evaluation proceeds as scheduled." The silence that followed was brief and absolute. Vaughn smiled with his mouth. "Of course. Shall we begin?" The first hour was procedural. Vaughn presented the program framework with practiced fluency, moving through slides and data that painted Redstone's emergency trauma training as a mature, well-resourced, effectively managed program. He referenced metrics, outcomes, staff certifications. He spoke about the department's commitment to excellence with the ease of a man who had delivered this presentation to every level of oversight that existed and always walked away intact. Emily watched the evaluators. She watched which questions they asked and which they didn't, where their eyes moved when Vaughn was talking, how they responded to his numbers. She said nothing. Her role in the morning's schedule was the simulation demonstration, which came after the overview. At 9:40, Vaughn turned to the room and said, "I'd like to demonstrate our standard mass casualty response protocol. My team will run the simulation. Ms. Carter—" He paused, and in that pause there was an entire history of the past 3 weeks. "Will assist with equipment coordination." The evaluators made notes. The simulation was about to begin. Through the observation window in the lab's side wall, Emily could see the corridor outside. Okafor was there, and Reyes, and Park, and Dobbins. She could see their faces through the glass, watching. She could also see, at the edge of the corridor, Flores. He had his phone in his hand. She looked away from the window and focused on the room in front of her, on the simulation equipment she'd been assigned to stand beside, on Vaughn, positioning himself at the center of the demonstration space with his department heads arranged around him and 6 federal evaluators positioned along the wall. She thought, "Here we go." And then, before a single simulated patient had been staged, before the scenario had begun, before Vaughn had finished gathering his team, the trauma bay doors at the far end of the corridor opened, and a voice from the nursing station cut through the building PA system with 3 words that changed everything. "Code orange incoming." Not simulated. The overhead light above the trauma bay entrance switched from white to amber, which was the code orange indicator, which meant mass casualty event, which meant what was coming through those doors was not a mannequin. Emily was moving before the second announcement completed. She crossed the lab in 4 steps, pushed through the connecting corridor door, and reached the trauma bay entrance as the first 2 paramedics came through with a gurney. Adult male, 40s, significant blunt trauma, blood pressure audible in his breathing, followed immediately by a second team with a female patient, conscious but deteriorating, and behind them the sound of a 3rd ambulance pulling up to the bay. She turned back to the simulation lab doorway. The evaluation team was frozen in the exact shape of people who had not yet processed that the situation had changed. Vaughn was standing in the center of the room with his demonstration notes in his hand. Multiple incoming, Emily said clearly. Real event. I need the trauma bay now. And then she turned, stepped into the bay, and started working. What she didn't see, because she was already moving, was Vaughn standing in the doorway of the simulation lab for 4 full seconds. 4 seconds in which the trauma bay was filling with real patience and real urgency before he followed. What she didn't see was Alderman reaching for a radio on her belt. What she didn't hear was Alderman saying very quietly to the lieutenant colonel beside her, "We're going to need the full record from this facility. Start from 30 days back." What she didn't know yet was that 3 of the 6 evaluators were not from the integration office at all. They had different credentials, different authority, and a very different purpose for being at Redstone Military Medical Center on a Thursday morning in November. She was in the trauma bay, calling out vitals and directing staff, her voice cutting through the noise with the particular quality of someone who had done exactly this before, in worse conditions, with less to work with. She had no idea what was coming down the corridor from the other direction. The first patient was a 43-year-old male, construction foreman, blunt thoracic trauma from a partial structure collapse at a site 2 miles from the installation. His name was Garrett, according to the paramedic handoff, and he was breathing in the shallow, effortful way that meant his chest wall was working harder than his lungs. Emily caught the paradoxical movement on his left side before the paramedic finished the report, the ribs moving in when they should move out when they should move in, and called it immediately. Flail chest, left lateral. I need a chest tray and someone on airway. She moved to the head of the gurney, assessed his pupils. Reactive, slightly unequal, which meant secondary concern but not primary, and looked for Reyes, who was already gloved and moving toward her. Okafor bed 2. Park, what's coming in behind? Park had her head out the corridor door. 2 more. One's a pediatric, maybe 12, 13, head trauma. Second is a woman, 40s, arm amputation. They've got a tourniquet. Emily processed this without breaking her hands off Garrett's chest assessment. Pediatric head trauma was the highest acuity of the 3 incoming. Bed 2 takes the pediatric when they're in. Dobbins. She raised her voice, and he was already there, large and quiet and completely functional. You're on the amputation. Pressure, tourniquet check, blood type as fast as you can get it. Got it, Dobbins said, and moved. Behind her, she heard the trauma bay doors open again and the controlled noise of 2 more gurneys coming in simultaneously. She did not look up from Garrett, whose oxygen saturation was dropping in real time on the monitor above his bed. His breathing was worsening. She needed to stabilize the chest wall. I need a second IV line and an O-negative cross-match, she said to no one in particular, which in a functional trauma bay meant whoever was closest and available, and 2 hands appeared beside her from a nurse she didn't know by name, which was fine, because the hands were competent, and that was what mattered. What she did not need, and what happened anyway, was Vaughn arriving at the edge of the trauma bay. She registered him in her peripheral vision, standing in the doorway between the corridor and the bay, still holding his demonstration notes, wearing the expression of a man trying to locate the version of events in which he was in charge of this situation. 2 of his department heads were behind him. Carter, he said. She didn't respond. She was watching the chest drain insertion point, which Reyes had prepped, and was waiting on her confirmation. Carter, this is my trauma bay. Needle thoracostomy first, then drain, she told Reyes, because Garrett's SATs had hit 81, and the tension component needed to be ruled out before anything else. Second intercostal, mid-clavicular. But Reyes did it without hesitation, and the immediate rush of air confirmed it. Tension pneumothorax, which meant Garrett had been 90 seconds from a fatal circulatory collapse. The monitor climbed. 84. 87. Carter, Vaughn's voice had sharpened. She turned and looked at him for exactly 1 second. If you're not treating a patient, step back. His face did something complicated. Marr behind him put a hand on Vaughn's arm. Not out of loyalty, Emily read instantly, but out of awareness that there were 6 federal evaluators somewhere behind them who were watching everything. Vaughn stepped back. He didn't go far, but he stepped back, and that was enough. The next 22 minutes were the kind of time that only exists in certain specific circumstances. compressed, and elastic simultaneously, each decision taking a fraction of a second and carrying the weight of something much larger. Emily moved through the trauma bay with the particular economy of someone who had done this in conditions where every wasted motion was a liability she couldn't afford. The pediatric patient, a 13-year-old girl named, according to the intake sheet, as Maya, site worker's daughter, had been near the collapse perimeter, had a GCS of 11 and a scalp laceration that was bleeding badly but was not the primary concern. The primary concern was the mechanism, blunt head trauma with brief loss of consciousness, now with a declining GCS. She needed a CT she couldn't get until she was stabilized. Okafor was on her, steady and focused, doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. Emily passed the bed, checked the pupil response over Okafor's shoulder, left sluggish, and said, "Neuroconsult, expedite imaging order. Keep her talking." "She's in and out," Okafor said. "Then keep pulling her back." Emily moved on. The amputation patient, Rena Soto, 41, the construction site safety coordinator, had been at the collapse edge when a beam shifted, was the most visually dramatic but the most procedurally straightforward, which was the counterintuitive reality of traumatic amputations with effective pre-hospital tourniquet placement. Dobbins had the situation in hand, blood pressure holding, patient conscious, and in shock but communicating. Emily checked the tourniquet position, confirmed the time it had been applied from the paramedic run sheet, and moved Soto up the surgical consult queue. "You're going to be okay," Dobbins told Soto in his low, unhurried voice. "My arm," Soto started, "is taken care of. Right now, I need you to stay with me." Emily didn't have time to note how naturally Dobbins handled it, but she noted it anyway in the back of her mind where she stored information that mattered. She returned to Garrett, whose chest drain was now in and whose SATs had climbed to 94, which was not good but was survivable. He needed a surgical consult for the rib fixation, and he needed it in the next 30 minutes. She called for it while simultaneously reviewing the blood work that had come back on the portable analyzer. His hemoglobin was low enough to indicate ongoing hemorrhage from somewhere, and the source wasn't the chest. "Abdominal assessment," she said to the nurse beside her. "Fast exam now." The ultrasound probe went to Garrett's abdomen. She watched the screen. Free fluid in Morrison's pouch, moderate volume, internal bleeding, liver or spleen most likely. Now he was a two-problem patient with a narrowing window. "Or," she said, "call it in. He needs to go up in the next 15 minutes. She straightened up and took a breath, the first full breath she'd consciously taken since the code orange, and that was when she became aware of the room around her in a way that the last 22 minutes hadn't allowed. The trauma bay was functioning. Not perfectly. Park had made a documentation error that another nurse was correcting. The portable monitor on bed 3 had a lead that kept slipping. There was a blood pressure cuff on the floor that no one had picked up yet. These were the normal imperfections of a functional emergency response. And around them, the work was being done correctly and quickly, and with the kind of collaborative instinct that didn't come from a drill. And along the wall of the trauma bay, very still, watching everything, were Alderman and 2 of the other evaluators. She hadn't forgotten they were there. She'd had no bandwidth to think about them. Now she met Alderman's eyes for a half second and looked away, because she had a patient going to OR and 2 more still requiring monitoring, and she did not have the luxury of managing impressions. What she saw in that half second, before she looked away, was the Brigadier General writing something in a small notebook with the focused attention of someone who was not writing observations about a trauma training program. But Vaughn made his move at the 28-minute mark. He'd been in the doorway, and then at the edge of the room, and then somehow incrementally closer. And when Garrett was being prepped for OR transport and the immediate crisis had reduced from acute to managed, Vaughn stepped forward into the center of the bay with the particular authority of a man reclaiming territory. "Good response, everyone," he said in his department chief voice, the one that implied the response had happened under his supervision. "This is exactly the kind of adaptive capacity we've been building. Ms. Carter provided some supplemental support during the initial intake, which was, 'Dr. Vaughn,' Alderman's voice from the wall. Not loud. Vaughn stopped. 'Were you present during the initial patient assessment?' Alderman asked. A beat. 'I was observing the response to ensure. Were you treating patients?' Another beat. Shorter. I was supervising. I see. Alderman made another note. Ms. Carter, can you give us a brief summary of the clinical decisions made in the last 30 minutes? Emily ran through it without notes. The pneumothorax identification and intervention on Garrett, the sequence of the chest drain, the fast exam findings and the OR escalation, the GCS tracking on Maya and the imaging priority, the tourniquet assessment on Soto. She spoke in the flat clinical shorthand of someone who had written after-action medical reports and knew what information mattered and what didn't. When she finished, the trauma bay was very quiet. Meyer was looking at the floor. The department head beside him, a man named Holt, who had been in the closed-door meeting Monday morning, was looking at a point somewhere above Emily's head. Neither of them looked at Vaughn. Vaughn himself was looking at Emily with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. The composure was still there, the surface of it, but underneath something had shifted, some foundational assumption that had been holding his self-presentation together, and the shift was visible in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands. That will be useful for our documentation, Alderman said. One of the other evaluators, the one Emily had noticed, was not from the integration office. A compact man named Harwick, who had said almost nothing all morning, stepped forward. Ms. Carter, I have a few questions about your clinical background. She looked at him. All right. Your personnel file lists your most recent positions as civilian trauma center work. Prior to that, 11 years in nursing with 2 extended absences described as personal leave. He paused. That's an unusual employment pattern. It is, she said. Can you tell me about those absences? She looked at him for a moment. Around the room, the evaluators had gone very still in the way that indicated this question was not incidental. That information is classified, she said. Harwick nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already known. The record attached to your DoD appointment has a security addendum. Colonel Wynn's office flagged it when your evaluation request came through. He opened a folder he'd been carrying. This is a summary record, not the full document which remains classified, but the summary contains enough to address some questions about your qualifications to direct this program. He set the folder on the equipment cart beside her, open. She didn't look at it. She knew what it said. She'd known, when she'd accepted this appointment, that the record existed and that certain people would eventually look at it. She'd known Wynn's office had it. She had simply never told Vaughn, because Vaughn had never asked, and she was under no obligation to explain herself to a man who had decided what she was without asking. Alderman spoke. Dr. Vaughn, I'd like to direct your attention to Section 3 of that summary. Vaughn crossed the room. He picked up the folder. He read. The trauma bay was absolutely silent for the 15 seconds it took him to read the relevant section, and then he set the folder down very carefully, the way a person sets something down when their hands have gone slightly unreliable, and he looked at Emily Carter. She looked back at him. You were... He stopped. The specific deployments are classified, Emily said. The relevant certifications and operational experience are in the summary. He looked back at the folder. She watched him process it, not just what it said about her qualifications, but what it meant about the past 3 weeks, about every condescension and obstruction and dismissal, about the woman he'd knocked to the floor in front of residents and cameras. You led combat rescue operations, he said, among other things. He checked the folder again, as if the numbers might have changed. 11 years. Yes. Marr had come close enough to read over Vaughn's shoulder, and the color had left his face in a way that was visible from across the room. Harwick spoke again. Ms. Carter's appointment to this position was made at the recommendation of 2 general officers and the Office of Military Medical Standards. The evaluation request she submitted triggered a review that was already in progress. A pause. Dr. Vaughn, you're aware that the Office of Military Medical Standards conducts institutional reviews of military medical facilities? Vaughn looked up from the folder. Yes. This facility has been under preliminary review for 4 months. Ms. Carter's appointment was part of that review process. Harwick's voice was professionally neutral, which made it somehow worse. The evaluation today is not limited to the training program. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Alderman closed her notebook. We'll need access to all administrative records, personnel communications, and facility security footage for the past 60 days. I'll need to consult with hospital administration. The access order has already been authorized, Alderman said. We'll begin this afternoon. Vaughn stood in the center of the trauma bay with the folder in his hands and said nothing. He was a man discovering that the building he'd been standing in for 20 years had a different foundation than he'd believed, and that the foundation had been examined by people he'd never seen, and that the examination was complete. Emily picked up Garrett's chart because Garrett was going to OR in the next few minutes, and someone needed to make sure the handoff documentation was correct. "Excuse me," she said, and walked past Vaughn to the OR prep area without looking at him again. She was halfway there when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, and then she did recognize it, the area code placing it immediately, and her steps slowed for just a fraction of a second before she opened it. 3 words. Check bay camera. She stopped walking. She looked at the text again. She turned and looked at the trauma bay behind her, at the camera mounted in the upper corner of the room, the one she'd noted in her first week, the one that had been running during the demonstration 3 weeks ago, the one that would have captured, at close range and high resolution, exactly what Richard Vaughn had done to her in front of a room full of witnesses. Her eyes moved to the corridor window. Flores was gone from the spot where she'd last seen him. His phone was not in his hand. She looked at the text on her screen. She did not know what Flores had done with the footage, or who he had sent it to, or when. She did not know what the camera in the bay had caught, or whether that footage had already been pulled into the 60-day security review that Alderman had just authorized. What she knew was that she was standing in a corridor with a patient's chart in her hands and an OR handoff to complete, and that everything else was already in motion, and had been for longer than anyone in that trauma bay had understood. She put the phone in her pocket and kept walking. Behind her, in the trauma bay, she heard Alderman's voice, steady and authoritative, asking for the facility administrator on duty. And then, cutting through that, something she hadn't expected. Vaughn's voice, no longer smooth, no longer the cadence of a man in control of his environment. Just a man's voice, stripped of its performance, saying something to Mar in a low and urgent tone that she couldn't fully make out, but caught 2 words of clearly. The footage. Her step didn't break, her face didn't change, but her hand tightened on the chart just slightly, and stayed that way until she pushed through the OR prep doors and let them close behind her. The OR handoff took 11 minutes, which was 4 minutes longer than it should have taken because the surgical resident on the receiving end was new enough that he needed the abdominal hemorrhage context explained twice before it registered. Emily did not let the impatience show. She walked him through Garrett's fast findings, the hemoglobin drop, the chest drain status, the blood pressure trend over the last 30 minutes, and she did it in the flat, sequential way that left no room for misinterpretation. The resident nodded, made his notes, and she watched him until she was confident the information had actually landed. Then she walked back out into the corridor and stopped moving for the first time in 40 minutes. The hallway outside the OR prep area was empty. Faint antiseptic smell, fluorescent light, the distant sound of a monitor alarming somewhere on the floor above. She stood with her back against the wall, looked at the ceiling for approximately 4 seconds, and let the physiological aftermath of sustained high-concentration work move through her. The slight tremor in her hands that she would not call adrenaline because naming it made it worse. The way her vision briefly sharpened at the edges in a way that was not entirely comfortable. These were things she'd learned to manage rather than suppress, because suppressing them didn't work, and managing them did. She breathed. She counted. She gave herself 30 seconds. Then she pulled out her phone, found the text from Flores's number, and typed back, "Are you still in the building?" The response came in under a minute. "Yes. Stairwell B, 3rd floor." She took the elevator to 3. What? Flores looked like he hadn't slept, which was probably accurate given that he'd spent the last several weeks carrying footage on his phone that he hadn't known what to do with. He was sitting on the 3rd step of the stairwell with his back against the wall, jacket still on, badge crooked on his lapel. He stood up when she pushed through the door, which told her he was nervous enough to feel the need to be upright for this conversation. "I gave it to Harwick," he said, before she could speak. "This morning, before 8. I found his office contact through the integration office website, And I emailed it to him last night, and then I went to his room at the base hotel this morning and confirmed he had it. Emily looked at him. When did you decide? Wednesday afternoon. He rubbed the back of his neck. After you said what you said, about what I could live with. A beat. I've been watching Vaughn for 8 months. I know what he does to people who can't fight back. I figured... He stopped. I figured if you were willing to walk into that building every morning for 3 weeks after what happened, the least I could do was send an email. She didn't say anything for a moment. Harwick's going to want a formal statement, she said finally. He already does. We have a meeting at 2. Flores exhaled. Vaughn's going to know it was me. Probably. He controls my residency evaluation. He did, Emily said. The scope of what's happening today extends past his ability to affect your evaluation. That's not a guarantee of easy. But the authority structure he's been operating under is being reviewed at a level above anything he can access or influence. Flores absorbed this. He was young enough that the reassurance didn't fully land. He'd grown up professionally in an environment where Vaughn's authority felt absolute, and absolute felt permanent, and permanent felt like the nature of things. It took time to recalibrate that. She understood that. You could have told me it would be fine, he said. It won't be fine. It'll be complicated and uncomfortable, and there'll be a period where you don't know how it resolves. She held his eyes. But you'll know what you did. That's not nothing. He nodded, the way young people nod when they've received an honest answer they weren't entirely prepared for, but respect more than the comfortable version. Thank you, Flores, she said, and pushed back through the stairwell door. The investigation team had taken over the 5th floor conference room and requisitioned 2 adjacent offices by the time Emily returned to the main building. She knew this because Torres appeared at her side with the information before she'd crossed the lobby. Torres, who had apparently appointed himself her logistical liaison somewhere in the last 4 hours without being asked and without acknowledgement. Harwick's office is in 512, Torres said, walking slightly too fast beside her. Alderman's team has pulled the security system access logs. IT is in the server room with 2 people from the review team. Vaughn is in his office with the hospital's legal counsel. A pause. Maher left the building at approximately 10:15 and hasn't returned. Emily stopped walking. Maher left? His car is gone from the parking structure. She processed this. Maher leaving was either panic or a prepared move. Either he was running from something or he was going somewhere he needed to be before the review team got there. Neither option was good for him. Both were potentially useful for the investigation. Has anyone flagged his departure to Alderman's team? I did, Torres said, with the quiet pride of someone who had made a correct decision without being told to. 20 minutes ago, they thanked me. Good. She started walking again. Where's Okafor? 2nd floor nursing station. The patients from this morning are all stable. Garrett is out of OR, Maya's in neuroimaging, Soto's in surgical holding. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Okay. Also, Torres hesitated. The hospital administrator wants to meet with you, Dr. Prentice. She came in at 11, after the code orange. Another hesitation. She looks like someone who just found out what's been happening in her facility, Emily finished. Yes. Schedule it for this afternoon, after I've spoken with Harwick. Torres made a note. They reached the elevator and he stayed behind, already on his phone, coordinating something she hadn't asked him to coordinate, but that would probably turn out to be necessary. She'd underestimated Torres at the beginning. She amended that. Harwick's temporary office smelled like hotel coffee and printer toner, 2 laptops open on the conference table, a filing stack that had grown substantially since morning. He gestured her to a chair and didn't waste time. The footage from the trauma bay camera covers the incident from November 7th, he said. Angle is consistent with the event description in your documentation. Audio is clear. He set a tablet on the table between them with a still frame visible. She could see the shape of the room, the equipment cart, the angle of the camera. She didn't need to watch it. Combined with your incident log, the witness statements we've collected this morning, and Dr. Flores' phone footage, we have a comprehensive record. How many witness statements? 7 so far, including 2 security staff members. He looked at her over the top of his glasses. One of them is the officer who was in the room during the November 7th incident. She absorbed this. The officer who had studied the ceiling. He came forward voluntarily? He submitted a written statement to our intake this morning before the code orange. Apparently he'd been carrying it for a while. Harwick paused. People do that sometimes. They wait for something that feels like permission. Emily didn't say anything. The 60-day security footage review has identified 9 additional incidents involving staff interactions with you that are consistent with a pattern of institutional harassment and professional obstruction, Harwick continued. We've also identified footage that documents equipment access interference, specifically the simulation lab access system and the shared drive for the third-floor conference room. She documented all of it, but seeing it confirmed from an external source with federal standing was a different thing from knowing it herself. What about the administrative record? She asked. Hark looked at her for a moment in the way of someone deciding how much to say. Ms. Carter, can I ask you something directly? Yes. Did you know when you arrived here that this facility was under preliminary review? She held his gaze. I knew that my appointment was connected to a process that extended beyond the standard integration framework. That's not quite an answer. No, she agreed. It's not. He studied her for another moment. The administrative records show a procurement irregularity that predates your arrival by approximately 14 months. Medical supply billing discrepancies, vendor relationship documentation that doesn't align with standard acquisition protocol. A pause. Dr. Vaughn has signature authority on the relevant accounts. This was the part she hadn't known. She'd known about the harassment, the obstruction, the institutional pattern of abuse against staff. She hadn't known about the procurement. How significant? She asked. Preliminary estimate is in the range of several $100,000 over 18 months. He said it the way accountants said large numbers, flat, factual, with the weight left to land on its own. We're still pulling records. It may be larger. She sat with that for a moment. Vaughn running a harassment campaign against a federal appointee while simultaneously managing a procurement fraud scheme. 2 separate exposures, each serious on its own, catastrophic in combination. He had no idea what was coming, she said. No. He appears to have believed that aggressive management of your position would resolve whatever concern your appointment represented. Hark allowed himself the faintest trace of something dry. He doesn't appear to have considered that your appointment was specifically designed to give us 60 days of uninterrupted access to the facility's operational environment. She didn't react to that, but the shape of it settled into place with a clarity that was almost geometric. The appointment, the integration framework, the evaluation trigger, the 60-day window. She'd been used as an instrument of a larger process, which she'd understood, and had chosen to accept because the larger process was legitimate and because what she'd found at Redstone was worse than even the preliminary review had indicated. What happens now? She asked. This afternoon, Dr. Vaughn will be formally notified that his administrative authority is suspended pending investigation. His medical privileges are under separate review through the State Medical Board, which we've already contacted. Harwick closed his folder. The hospital administrator, Dr. Prentice, will be briefed on the procurement findings as well as the conduct investigation. She'll need to make decisions about interim facility leadership. And Mar? A pause. His departure this morning is noted in our record. We've been in contact with the appropriate personnel. He said nothing more specific than that, which told her enough. She found Okafor in the break room off the second-floor nursing station, sitting with a cold cup of coffee and the particular stillness of someone who had been running at high intensity for 4 hours and had very suddenly stopped. Park was there too, leaning against the counter, and Reyes was on the other side of the table, jacket off, looking at his hands. Dobbins was not there. He was, Torres had mentioned, still with Soto in surgical holding, which tracked. Nobody said anything when Emily walked in. They looked at her and she looked back at them, and there was a moment of the particular kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to annotate it. Garrett's out of OR, she said. Stable. Maya's scan came back, Okafor said. Mild contusion, no bleed. She's awake and talking. Good. Reyes looked up. What happened upstairs? It's being handled. That's not an answer. I know. She sat down at the table, across from Okafor, which was the first time she'd sat down since 6 in the morning, and the chair felt like a significant event. Vaughn's authority is being suspended this afternoon. There's a broader investigation in progress. I can't give you specifics because I don't have authorization to, but what you did today, what all of you did, it's on record. It matters. Park wrapped her hands around her own cold coffee. What about the rest of the department? Vaughn's people? That's going to take longer to untangle. Emily was honest about it. There are staff who covered for him, looked away when they shouldn't have, stayed quiet when speaking up would have helped. That's a spectrum. Some of it is going to result in formal consequences. Some of it is going to result in people having to live with what they did. Nobody argued with that. They'd all been somewhere on that spectrum themselves, at various points, and they knew it. For right now, Emily said, you have a shift to finish, and patients who need competent care. That's what I need from you. Reyes stood, put his jacket back on. You're not going to tell us it was worth it, or that we did the right thing? She looked at him. You know whether it was worth it. I don't need to tell you that. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once, the short nod of someone receiving the respect of being taken seriously, and walked out. Dr. Prentice was 61 years old, recently appointed hospital administrator, and was having the worst Thursday of her professional life. Emily could see it in the set of her shoulders when they met in the administrator's office at 3 in the afternoon. The posture of a woman who had arrived at an institution in good faith and was in the process of discovering what the institution had been doing behind the facade she'd been managing. I've been here 8 months, Prentice said, not as an excuse, more as a statement she needed to make out loud. The procurement accounts they go back before I arrived. I know, Emily said. The conduct issues. Prentice stopped, restarted. I received 1 complaint in 8 months, 1, from a staff member who then rescinded it. A pause. I should have pushed harder. Yes, Emily said, and let it sit without softening it, because Prentice seemed like a person who needed the unvarnished version more than she needed comfort. Prentice looked at her directly. I owe you an apology. You weren't in the room for any of it. I was running the institution that allowed it. She said it flatly, owning it, which Emily found she respected. What do you need from me going forward? Interim leadership for the trauma department while the investigation runs. Someone who isn't connected to Vaughn's network. I have someone in mind. Outside appointment, military medical background, no existing allegiance to the current departmental structure. Good. Emily paused. The nursing staff on the second floor. Okafor, Reyes, Park, Dobbins. They performed at a level today that this institution hasn't been giving them credit for. Whatever review process follows, that should be in the record. It will be. Prentice wrote something. Is there anything else? The residency program. Flores should be reviewed by someone outside the current evaluation structure. His rotation assignments shouldn't be touched while the investigation is active. Done. Prentice set her pen down. Ms. Carter, what you did this morning in the trauma bay, the clinical response. She paused, searching for the right words and not quite finding them. I read the summary record that General Alderman's team gave me. Emily waited. I wish I'd read it before October, Prentice said. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Richard Vaughn received formal written notification of the suspension of his administrative authority delivered by Harwick in the presence of 2 witnesses and the hospital's legal counsel. Emily was not there for the delivery. She was on the second floor checking Maya's neuroassessment update and reviewing Soto's surgical notes. She heard about the delivery from Torres, who seemed to have been physically present in multiple locations simultaneously, and was managing this by texting her updates while also being visible in various corridors. Vaughn took the notification and said nothing, Torres texted. His counsel asked for a copy and they left together. Then, 3 minutes later, Maher has been located. He was at the facility's off-site storage archive. Federal personnel are with him. She read this standing at the nurse's station and felt nothing dramatic. No satisfaction, exactly. More the sensation of a long-sustained tension releasing incrementally, the way a structure settles after the load-bearing pressure has been redistributed. She put the phone away and went back to her notes. At 5:45, she was in her office. The storage room office with the brackets on the wall and the rust view window. Finishing the clinical documentation from the morning's code. Orange when she heard footsteps in the corridor that stopped at her door. She looked up. Vaughn was standing in the doorway. No legal counsel, no department heads, just him in his coat, badge already off his lapel, holding it in his hand like he wasn't sure what to do with it. He looked different in a way that was difficult to specify. The same face, the same build, but the authority had left it, not gradually, but all at once, the way light leaves a room. She set down her pen and waited. He stood in the doorway for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable and didn't seem to care. Then he said, "I misjudged you." His voice was flat. Not contrite, not theatrical, just flat, like a man stating a fact he'd recently had to accept. She looked at him. "You judged appearances," she said. "I trusted actions." He absorbed this. He looked at the badge in his hand, then back at her. "I've been told," he said, "that I'll be given the opportunity to respond to the investigation findings. I intend to cooperate." "That's between you and the investigators." "Yes." He stood there one more second, in the way of a man who has more to say and knows none of it will help him. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked away down the corridor. She listened to his footsteps. Regular pace. No haste. She picked up her pen and went back to her documentation. She was almost finished when Torres appeared again, which by this point felt less like an event and more like weather. "General Alderman is looking for you," he said. "Tell her I'll be up in 10 minutes. She said it's not urgent, but—" Torres paused. She had something in her hand, looked like a letter, official letterhead. Emily finished the sentence she was writing. She reviewed the last paragraph. She made one correction. Then she closed the folder, stood up, and looked around the storage room office for a moment. The shelf brackets, the courtyard window, the rust on the heating unit catching the last of the afternoon light. She'd been in worse places. She reminded herself of this, as she always did. Just a fact. She picked up her jacket and walked out. Alderman was on the 5th floor in the corridor outside the commandeered conference room, standing with her notebook closed and her hands at her sides, in the at-ease posture of someone who had decided the work portion of the day was done and was waiting with the patience of someone who had learned it professionally. When Emily reached her, Alderman held out the letter without preamble. Emily took it, DOD letterhead. She read the first paragraph, then the second. Her expression didn't change in any way that was visible. "When did this come through?" she asked. "This morning, before we arrived," Alderman said. "I held it until the clinical situation was resolved." Emily read it again. The language was formal and dense, as DOD communications tended to be, but the substance was not ambiguous. A formal commendation, the announcement of a program redesign initiative, and, in the final paragraph, an appointment, not a training directorship, something larger. "I want it noted," Emily said, "that the nursing staff on the 2nd floor should be part of whatever program model comes out of this. Okafor, Reyes, Park, Dobbins, they're the standard." "Noted," Alderman said. "Is that a yes?" Emily folded the letter. She looked out the 5th floor window at the parking lot below, the Blue Ridge foothills dark against the late sky, frost already forming on the windshields in long rows. She didn't answer immediately, which wasn't hesitation. It was the habit of a person who didn't give answers she hadn't finished thinking through. Then she said, "I need to check on a patient first." Alderman looked at her for a moment, and something in the general's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible. Not surprise, more like recognition, like someone seeing a thing they'd been told about confirmed in real time. "Take your time," she said. Emily walked to the elevator and went back down to the 2nd floor. She pushed through the door to the recovery area where Garrett had been brought post-OR. He was awake, oxygen still running, color better than it had been 8 hours ago. His wife was in the chair beside the bed, the specific exhausted posture of someone who had been called away from their normal life without warning and had not yet had time to process what almost happened. Garrett looked up when Emily came in. "You were the one," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. "In the bay this morning, you were running everything." "I was doing my job," she said. "They told me about the air thing in my chest." He was working out the words carefully, the way people did when they'd been given medical information while still disoriented. They said if that hadn't been caught when it was caught, Emily said. You're here. He looked at her for a long moment. His wife reached across and put her hand over his, not looking at Emily, just holding on to the thing she hadn't lost. Thank you, Garrett said. Emily looked at him and his wife and the monitor above the bed showing his vitals in steady green lines. Rest, she told him, and walked back out. In the elevator on the way back up to the 5th floor, she unfolded the letter and read the final paragraph one more time. The appointment was real. The scope was real. The acknowledgement of what had happened at Redstone, in the careful language of official documentation that named nothing directly but made everything clear, was real. She folded it again and put it in her jacket pocket, next to the physical copy of her incident documentation that she'd been carrying since the morning she sent the evaluation request. She wrote up to 5. She had an answer for Alderman. What she didn't have, what she was still turning over as the elevator doors opened, was the thing that Torres had said when she'd reviewed the facility footage with Harwick that afternoon. A passing detail, almost incidental, buried in the summary of the 60-day security review. A procurement authorization that bore Vaughn's signature. And beside it, on 3 separate transactions, a counter-signature. Not Maher. Someone else. A name she recognized from the hospital organizational chart, from the department structure, from the ordinary background of Redstone's institutional life. A name attached to an office she had walked past every day for 6 weeks and had never thought to examine closely. She'd noted it, flagged it with Harwick before she left his temporary office, confirmed that it had been included in the materials being reviewed. Harwick had said very carefully that the countersignature was a matter of active interest. He had not said that it had been investigated. He had not said that the person attached to it had been notified. The elevator opened on 5, and Emily walked out into the corridor where Alderman was waiting, and she was already composing the question she needed to ask before she accepted anything. The appointment, the commendation, the resolution that the official documentation was already trying to write, because there was a name on 3 procurement authorizations that nobody had yet explained to her, and she did not accept conclusions with unexplained variables, and never had. She reached Alderman, and before the general could speak, Emily said, I have a question about the counter-signature records, before we talk about the letter. Alderman's expression shifted. Which records? The 3 procurement transactions, Vaughn's signature and one other. She looked at Alderman steadily. Whose name is on those, General? And the way Alderman went very still, just for a half second, the involuntary stillness of someone who has been asked the exact question they were not yet ready to answer, told Emily that the thing she'd flagged with Harwick was not a secondary detail. It was the center of something she hadn't yet been shown. Alderman's stillness lasted exactly long enough to confirm what Emily had already suspected, that the name on those countersignatures was not a loose end, but a load-bearing wall, and that the investigation had known about it before today. Come inside, Alderman said. The conference room was quieter now, the second team of reviewers gone to the server room and the administrative archive, leaving behind the paper residue of a day's worth of accelerated investigation. Folders stacked by category, 2 laptops still open, a whiteboard with names and transaction dates in dry erase marker that someone had partially erased and then stopped. Emily looked at the whiteboard without appearing to look at it. She could read what remained. The name circled at the top was Vaughn's. Below it, connected by 2 lines, were Mar, and a third name she recognized because she had seen it on every facilities management memo that had crossed her desk for 6 weeks. Dale Ostroff, Deputy Director of Hospital Operations. Alderman sat down across the table from her. Ostroff has been with Redstone for 11 years, she said. He manages vendor contracts, supply chain authorization, and facilities budget allocation. His office sits between Vaughn's administrative authority and the actual procurement execution. So Vaughn approved the scheme, Emily said, and Ostroff ran it. Vaughn provided institutional cover and signature authority. Ostroff had the operational knowledge and the vendor relationships. Alderman folded her hands on the table. Without Ostroff, the procurement irregularities stay as Vaughn's problem. With him, it becomes a coordinated scheme with defined roles and a paper trail through 2 offices. When were you going to tell me? Alderman looked at her directly. when we had enough to move on Ostroff without warning him, which required keeping the circle small. A pause. You were inside the facility every day. If you'd known, there was a risk that normal behavior change, even unconscious, even minor, might have been detectable. Emily accepted this. It was operationally sound, even if it sat uncomfortably. She'd been a useful instrument of the investigation in ways she hadn't fully known, which was not the first time in her professional life that she'd occupied that position. "Where's Ostroff now?" she asked. "His office, as far as we know. He hasn't been notified of anything yet." Alderman looked at her watch. "Harwick is preparing the notification package. It goes to him in approximately 40 minutes. And then? And then we have a second suspension, a second set of administrative consequences, and a significantly more complete picture of what's been operating inside this facility." Alderman paused. "The State Medical Board has been contacted regarding Vaughn. The DoD Inspector General's office is coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office on the procurement findings. That process will take months. But the direction is established." Emily looked at the whiteboard. Vaughn's name at the top, lines going down. She thought about the shape of it, how an institution could operate this way for over a year, with enough people knowing just enough to keep their heads down and their paychecks arriving. "How many people in the facility knew about the procurement irregularities?" she asked. "We believe 3 with direct knowledge, several more with proximity who chose not to look closely." Alderman's voice held no judgment in it, just fact. "Institutions are good at producing that particular kind of not looking." "Yes," Emily said, "they are." She was in the corridor outside Ostroff's office at 6:23 p.m. when Harwick delivered the notification. She had not been asked to be there, and Alderman had not suggested it, but no one had told her not to be either, and she had walked the building all day making decisions about where she needed to be. She stood on the opposite side of the corridor, far enough to be uninvolved, close enough to observe. Ostroff was a compact man in his mid-50s with the look of someone who had spent a career being competently invisible. The person who made systems run and made sure nobody looked too hard at how. He opened his office door to Harwick's knock with the mild expression of someone expecting a routine administrative question, and the sequence of his face changing as Harwick presented the notification, and 2 additional personnel stepped into his eye line with something Emily would carry with her as a specific kind of image, the moment when a person who believed themselves protected understands they are not. He didn't argue. He didn't perform outrage. He looked at the documents, looked at Harwick, and then looked past Harwick at the corridor, and saw Emily standing there. She didn't move. She didn't look away. He looked at her for 3 seconds, and then he looked back at Harwick and said, "I'd like to call my attorney." "Of course," Harwick said. The door closed. Emily walked back down the corridor to the elevator. Her hands were steady. They had been steady all day, through the trauma bay and the OR handoff and Vaughn in her doorway, and she was running on something that was not quite adrenaline anymore, but had the same quality of clean forward motion, the sense of a sequence of events moving in the direction they should move. She pressed the button for the second floor. She was going to check on her patients. Maya was sitting up in her hospital bed watching something on a tablet when Emily pushed the door open, her mother beside her and a neuro-resident completing notes on a wall-mounted screen. The scalp laceration had been closed, her GCS was 15, and she had the particular bright-eyed quality of a 13-year-old who had frightened her mother badly and was not yet old enough to fully understand how close the margin had been. "Are you the one who was in charge this morning?" Maya asked, without preamble. "I was one of the people helping," Emily said. "My dad works at the construction site. He's okay. They told me he's okay." A pause. "The lady with the arm, is she okay?" "She's in surgical care. She's stable." Maya processed this with the focused seriousness of a kid who wanted real information and recognized when she was getting it. "I went unconscious," she said. "I don't remember the ambulance." "That's normal with your type of injury. Your brain needed some time." "It was weird," Maya said, not frightened, just factual. "Like a gap." "I know," Emily said. She looked at Maya's mother, who hadn't said anything, who was sitting with her hand on her daughter's arm, and the particular expression of a parent who has sat in a hospital chair waiting to find out whether a specific thing was going to be all right. The expression of someone who has been on the far side of a door that could have opened differently. Emily said quietly, "She's going to be fine." Maya's mother nodded once and didn't say anything, and that was the right amount. Emily updated her notes in the doorway and moved on. The second-floor nursing station was in the process of shift change when she passed, which meant a density of people and the organized noise of handoffs, patient status, medication flags, room notes passing from one set of hands to the next. She caught Okafor's eye across the station, and Okafor extracted herself from the handoff she was completing and came around the counter. "I heard about Ostroff," Okafor said low. Word moved fast in hospitals. Emily had known this and was not surprised. "Formal notification this evening," Emily said. "Don't circulate it further tonight. People will know tomorrow." "Maher?" Also being addressed. Okafor looked at her for a moment. She had that expression again. Not quite disbelief, more like someone revising an estimate they'd thought was already final. "You knew about all of it." "I knew about some of it," Emily said. "The rest I found out today." "And you still came in every morning and documented everything and ran drills and—" Okafor stopped herself. "How did you not—" She stopped again. "How were you not angry?" Emily thought about how to answer that. It was a real question and it deserved a real answer, not a performance of composure. "I was angry," she said. "I'm not made of something different than you. I was angry every day." A pause. "But anger is a cost and I needed my resources for other things. So I put it somewhere and left it there until I could afford to look at it." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "And now? Can you afford to look at it now?" "Maybe," Emily said. "Tomorrow." Okafor almost smiled, which was the closest thing to warmth that the day had produced, and Emily found that she didn't hate it. "Go finish your shift," Emily said. And she found Reyes in the break room again. The same chair, different coffee, this one still warm. He was on the phone when she walked in, and from the one side of the conversation she caught, "Yeah, I know, it's fine. I'll tell you everything when I'm home." She gathered it was someone who had heard a partial version of the day from a distance and was worried. He ended the call and looked at her. "My sister saw something online about Redstone." "What kind of something?" "Vague. Activity outside the building. Federal vehicles." He set the phone down. "It's going to be in the news." She sat down across from him. This was the part she hadn't thought through completely. The institutional investigation would move at its own pace through official channels, but the public information would move faster and less carefully, and the people in this building would be living inside that coverage while trying to do their jobs. "When it becomes public," she said, "you don't have to comment on anything. That's not an obligation you have." "I know." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He stopped. "I've been here 3 years. Vaughn did that to people the whole time I was here. I saw it. I didn't do enough about it." "What did you do?" "Not enough." "Specifically," she said, "what did you do?" He looked up, slightly wrong-footed by the question. "I filed one internal complaint 2 years ago. It went nowhere. After that, I mostly kept my head down." "You stayed. You kept doing good work. This morning you performed at a level that helped save 3 people's lives." She held his eyes. "You also responded when it mattered today, when the shape of it was clear enough to respond to. That's not nothing. It's not enough either." "No," she said. "It's not. But most of doing better is starting from where you are, not where you wish you'd been." He sat with that. She could see him working it through, the particular labor of a person who held themselves to a real standard and was trying to figure out how to live with the gap between it and their actual history. "What happens to you now?" he asked. "I have a new appointment." She said it plainly. "Different scope. It came through today." "You're leaving Redstone?" "The position at Redstone was always temporary." She paused. "But what gets built here isn't. The people doing the work here, that's what stays." He nodded slowly. Then he said with a slight rough edge that she recognized as sincerity stripped of performance, "I'm glad you came here." She looked at him. "Me too," she said, and meant it more than she expected to. Alderman found her at 7:45 in the lobby, which had gone quiet by then, the day staff long gone, and the evening running on its reduced-density routine. The general had changed from her uniform into civilian clothes, which made her look like a different kind of authority. Less institutional, more personal. "We're done for the evening," Alderman said. "The review team is securing the records overnight. We'll resume tomorrow morning. Is there anything you need from me tonight?" "No." Alderman looked at her for a moment. "You should go home, Ms. Carter. You've been here since 6. 15 minutes, Emily said. "There's something I want to finish." Alderman nodded and walked out through the main entrance, and Emily went back to her storage room office for the last time that day. She sat at her desk in the light of her laptop and pulled up her documentation archive. She reviewed the incident log she'd been building for 6 weeks, 43 entries organized by date and category, with attached evidence for 31 of them. She checked that all copies were current on the external servers, confirmed that Harwick's team had received the full package, and then saved a final version with the day's additions included. Then she sat back and looked at the shelf brackets on the wall. She thought about the 11 years that the summary record described in 3 paragraphs, the deployments, the casualties she hadn't saved, and the ones she had. The particular education of learning what mattered and what didn't, when the margin between outcomes was measured in minutes, and the resources available were never exactly what they should have been. She thought about why she'd accepted this appointment, when she could have said no, when she had in fact nearly said no, sitting at her kitchen table in Clarksburg with the DOD letter in her hand and the coffee going cold. She'd accepted it because the preliminary review summary she'd been shown described an institution that was hurting the people inside it, and because she had a skill set that was relevant to fixing that, and because, this was the part she didn't usually let herself articulate, because she had spent 11 years doing a job where the people around her were held to an absolute standard by circumstances that didn't negotiate, and coming back to a civilian environment where the standard was whatever the most protected person in the room decided it was, had produced in her a specific and durable anger that she'd been putting somewhere and not looking at for a long time. She'd told Okafor that she could look at it tomorrow. She looked at it now, alone in the storage room office, and it was less dramatic than she'd been treating it. It was just the ordinary anger of someone who'd watched people with power use it carelessly against people without it, for long enough that the carelessness had become the environment, and the environment had become the norm, and the norm had become the thing that everyone inside it had to negotiate around just to do their jobs. She was angry about that. She had always been angry about that, and she had found, over time, that the most effective container for that anger was not expression, but action, and that action done carefully and persistently and with full documentation produced outcomes that expression alone never had. She'd been right about that. She was right about it still. She closed the laptop, picked up her jacket, and walked out. The news broke the following morning. Not comprehensively. The initial reports were vague, pulling from public records about the federal vehicles and the facility review, and most of the specific details were still inside official processes that wouldn't release them for weeks. But the shape of it was visible enough. Federal investigators at Redstone Military Medical Center. Administrative review underway. Key personnel suspended. By mid-morning, it had made the local news websites, and by afternoon, the regional affiliates were running it. By the time it reached the national level 3 days later, Vaughn's suspension had become a formal removal, and the state medical board had opened its own proceedings, and the U.S. Attorney's Office had confirmed in one careful sentence that a financial investigation was ongoing. Vaughn did not speak publicly. His attorney issued a brief statement about cooperation and due process, which was the language of a man whose attorney had reviewed the evidence and advised strongly against elaboration. Maher, who had been at the off-site archive attempting to access vendor contract records when the federal personnel arrived, was placed on administrative suspension pending his own investigation. He also did not speak publicly. His attorney did not issue any statement at all, which was its own kind of communication. Ostrov's name entered the public record on day 4 when the U.S. Attorney's Office filed the first formal document of its financial investigation. By that point, the hospital had already appointed interim trauma department leadership. A military physician named Dr. Keene brought in at Prentice's request with the specific mandate to stabilize the department and begin a full protocol review. Emily was not at Redstone for most of this. She was in Washington for 3 days for briefings related to the new appointment, sitting in conference rooms explaining the operational realities of what she'd found at Redstone to people who had the authority to make sure those realities informed what came next. She answered questions for 8 hours the first day and 6 hours the second, and was told on the third morning that she was done, which was the DOD way of saying they had what they needed. She drove back to Ashford on the fourth day. What? The formal recognition event was held in the Redstone conference room on the 5th floor, the same room where Vaughn had been running his presentation when the evaluation team arrived. This was not an accident of scheduling. Prentice had chosen the location with the particular awareness of a woman making a point that she felt needed to be made without being stated. It was not a large event. The military does not do large events for things it considers operational matters rather than ceremonial ones, and this was, officially, an operational matter. Alderman was there, and Harwick, and Prentice, and 2 representatives from the integration office. Torres was there because no one had thought to not invite him, and also because he had earned it. Flores was there at Emily's specific request, which she had stated plainly to Prentice and which Prentice had honored without question. Okafor, Reyes, Park, and Dobbins were there. The letter from the DOD was read aloud by Alderman, which was slightly more ceremony than Emily was comfortable with, but she stood through it without fidgeting, which was about the most she could offer. The commendation language was formal and restrained in the specific way that military commendations were restrained. It described actions and outcomes without embellishment, and the absence of embellishment was the point, because the actions described were significant enough that embellishment would have diminished them. When Alderman finished reading, she set the letter down and looked at Emily and said, in a register that was distinctly off the official script, "You did this the right way. I want that noted." "I had a lot of documentation help," Emily said, and looked at Torres, who turned red in the way of someone who had not expected to be acknowledged in a room containing a general officer. There was a brief, slightly awkward pause of the kind that occurs in rooms full of people who are more comfortable with procedural clarity than open sentiment. Then Okafor, from the back of the room, said, "Can we clap?" And someone laughed. Reyes probably, or maybe Flores, it was hard to tell. And the awkwardness broke. And for a moment, the conference room on the 5th floor of Redstone Military Medical Center felt like a room full of people who had been through something together and were still standing, which was, in Emily Carter's experience, about the best possible definition of a good outcome. She cleaned out the storage room office that afternoon. It didn't take long. She hadn't accumulated much. A laptop, a charger, the printed documentation copies she'd been carrying, 3 weeks of notes and 2 legal pads, a coffee mug she'd bought from the cafeteria on week 2 because the corridor machine was still broken. She put everything into a shoulder bag and stood in the office one last time. The shelf brackets, the courtyard window, the rust. She'd sat in this room and built a case against a man who believed himself untouchable, using tools that cost her nothing but time and consistency, and the combination had been enough. She thought, it usually is. If you're patient enough and precise enough, and you don't let the anger swallow the strategy. She turned off the light and closed the door. Downstairs, she found Dobbins in the corridor outside the surgical wing, which was where she'd expected to find him, because Dobbins had been checking on Soto every day since the Code Orange, and had not mentioned this to anyone, which was very Dobbins. "How is she?" Emily asked. "Good." He fell into step beside her with the ease of someone who had decided he was walking wherever she was walking. They fitted her for a prosthetic consult. She's already asking about return-to-work timelines, which the surgeon says is annoying, but also a positive sign. "That tracks," Emily said. "She asked about you," Dobbins said. "Soto. She wanted to know the name of the nurse who was running the bay." Emily considered this. "What did you tell her?" "Your name." A pause. "She said she wanted to write a letter. I told her the hospital would forward it." Emily didn't respond to that. She looked at the hallway ahead of them, the corridor light, the ordinary activity of a hospital floor in mid-afternoon. "What are you doing next?" Dobbins asked. "New position. Starts in 6 weeks. Bigger?" "Different." She glanced at him sideways. "National scope. Military-civilian emergency training integration. The model is based on what we demonstrated here. Dobbins walked a few steps without saying anything. Then, "We're in the model?" "You are," she said. "The response you ran this morning, the structure of it, the decision-making sequence, the cross-training capacity. That's what the framework is built on. You and Okafor and Reyes and Park." He was quiet again. The specific quiet of a large man who felt something strongly and had learned not to perform it. "Does that feel like anything?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It does." They reached the lobby and he stopped because his shift was starting in 20 minutes and he had a direction and she had another. She held out her hand and he shook it. A proper handshake. Two people who respected each other, no theater attached. "Take care of the floor," she said. "We will," he said. She stopped at the nursing station one last time because Okafor was there, and because there were things that needed to be said between them that had not yet been said. Okafor looked up from her notes and read something in Emily's expression and said, "You're leaving today." "Yes." A beat. "Do you want a goodbye speech? Because I have one and it's fairly good." "No," Emily said. "I really don't." "That's fair." Okafor put her pen down and gave her full attention, which, with Okafor, felt like a resource being deliberately allocated. "You changed this floor. I want you to know that. Not the investigation, not the commendation, the way you worked, the way you made us work." "You were already capable of it," Emily said. "I just arranged the circumstances." "That's what good leadership is," Okafor said simply. Emily looked at her for a moment. 27 years old, steady and clear-eyed, with the kind of specific competence that would build into something significant over time if the environment around her was worth building in. "It's going to be different here," Emily said. "Not immediately. The investigation is going to run for months, and the transition is going to be uncomfortable. But the structure under you is different now." "I know," Okafor said. "I can feel it already. If it stops feeling that way, if the new structure starts producing the same patterns, I know what to do," Okafor said. "Yes," Emily said. "You do." She picked up her bag and walked toward the main entrance. She did not look back, not because the people behind her didn't matter, but because looking back was not how she moved through things. Forward was the direction. It had always been the direction. The past existed as information, as record, as the documented evidence of what had happened and what needed to change. Not as a place to stand. Outside, the parking lot was cold. The Blue Ridge going to late afternoon gray in the distance. The trees bare now. November properly arrived. She unlocked her car and put her bag on the passenger seat and sat for a moment without starting the engine. 6 weeks ago, she'd sat in this same position and looked at this same entrance and told herself she'd been in worse places. That was still true. It was always true. There would always be worse places, harder situations, more deeply compromised institutions, more powerful people who decided that the rules were for everyone except them. There would always be the moment of walking into a room where you'd already been categorized, assessed, and dismissed, and having to decide whether to perform the smallness they expected of you or to do the thing you were actually there to do. She had chosen the same way every time, not because it was easy or because it was recognized or because it ended without cost. It had never been any of those things, but because it was right, and being right about something was not a reward. It was just the minimum standard for being able to look at yourself squarely. She started the car. The appointment letter was in her jacket pocket. The new position was real. The work ahead of it was the kind she'd been trained for, the kind that mattered, the kind that would outlast any single facility or any single case of institutional rot. A framework that would change how military and civilian trauma programs trained and certified and supported each other, built on the demonstrated model of what a functional trauma team actually looked like when the environment let them be functional. Built on Okafor's steadiness, Reyes's instinct, Park's precision, Dobbins' quiet, reliable presence beside a patient who was frightened and needed someone to mean it when they said, "Stay with me." Built on Torres, who had apologized for a bad office and documented what he saw and flagged a departure, and turned out to be exactly the kind of person an institution needed in the middle positions. Not heroic, not reckless, just present and honest and consistently small, decently good. Built on Flores, who had sat with footage on his phone for 3 weeks and then sent the email. She thought about what she would carry forward from this. Not the anger which she'd looked at the night before and was ready to set down. Not the image of Vaughn reading the summary record with his face changing. Not even the moment in the trauma bay when the work had overtaken everything else, and she'd simply been doing the things she knew how to do, in the place where it was needed. What she would carry was simpler. The knowledge that institutions could change. That they change slowly and imperfectly, and usually at the cost of someone who was willing to stay in the room past the point of comfort. That the cost was real and the change was also real, and both of those things being true simultaneously did not require resolution. They just required honesty about what the work actually was. This was what she knew. This was what she had to offer. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward the highway. The road was clear and the distance was manageable, and she had exactly enough fuel, which was more than she usually started with. That was enough. Some institutions protect the wrong people for a very long time. They do this not because everyone inside them is corrupt, but because silence is cheap and it compounds, and by the time the cost becomes visible, it looks like the cost of everything. Shit. Too large to challenge, too embedded to remove. But it isn't. The people who discovered that are not exceptional. They are people who decided at a specific moment that the price of staying quiet was higher than the price of staying. There's always someone in the building who knows. The question is whether the building is worth the truth they're carrying. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you have to build the building first with your own hands, in a storage room with shelf brackets and a broken courtyard window. And sometimes that's exactly where the most important things get built.